that there's this tension and hatred towards C31s from old members, which didn't seem to be the case with Kaos's people. Now, I wanted to find out why is that? What is it that is? And also, you know, I wanted to look at larger issue of the way kinship is practiced, because, you know, most people, when you ask them about your culture, you know, they will say, do you know your culture? You know, I'll be working at various Aboriginal organizations, and this would kind of come up. He says, well, people would say, I don't really know my culture. I'd say, we don't, you know, go to powwows. We don't go to sweats. You know, when I was living in Toronto, I would hear this a lot. And I'd say, well, you know, you're from Moose Factory. There weren't powwows up in Moose Factory, right? But you know, these outwardly and public expression of culture have taken on, or people have assumed that these are if you don't somehow partake or participate in those public or outwardly, you know, public expressions of culture, then really you don't know your culture, right? And so I wanted to find out, well, what about the way people interact in their family? What about that? And people don't usually think of these everyday things that we do as being cultural, right? The run-of-the-mill things. You know, when you walk into a room and you see an elder there, what do you do when that happens, right? When you get into that situation. When someone in your family is in the hospital, what do? Well, we know that if there's someone in a Native family is in the hospital, there's 50 people show up. And the nurses will come out and say, whoa, this is just for immediate family, right? And we'll say, well, yeah, the rest are coming, right? The rest are coming, right? Just give them, you know, maybe tomorrow the rest will be here. You know, so the idea of immediate family has kind of there's a different take on it from non-native to native. But many native people won't see this as being unusual or cultural, right? Everyone does this, don't they, right? But in fact, you know, no, they don't, right? And so I wanted to find out, you know, wanted to look at how kinship plays out in the contemporary context, and try to understand why it plays out in this way. Why is it that 50 people, for example, although I don't actually look at that in my research, but why is it that there would be 50 people show up at the hospital? You're welcome. And what's the basis of that? I mean, after 135 years or whatever it is of the Indian Act and the residential schools and the churches and the perception that the racist perceptions of non-native people, of First Nations people, all have an impact and changing the way we do things, right? They've all have had an impact on the way we do things. But even with all that stuff, not everything has changed, right? The residential schools were a failure because they didn't completely assimilate First Nations people, right? They didn't completely assimilate First Nations people because First Nations people were not passive, right? They would find out ways, they would do things, they would employ strategies that actually continued their cultural practices. So even though we had all these different pressures, there's been all these different pressures placed on First Nations people to change their culture, it hasn't exactly played out that way. There's been many cultural practices have been maintained. And but even though some of these culture practices have been maintained and some have changed, and even though that when you look at it today, you say, well, First Nations people do this, white people do this. They kind of look the same. What's the difference, right? Because, I mean, that's part of the assimilation process, right? These cultures, but even culturally, there will still be stuff that First Nations people do that, say, European people also used to do that would look the same, right? Because, there's only a few ways you can be alive, right? I mean, we love people, no matter if you're First Nation or not, right? But the way the origins or the basis of for these actions may have been completely different, right? The First Nations and started out from a place of over here, where and the actions were all based on certain values and guidelines and all. And over here, they started out over here for Europeans, and they may be coming closer and closer to being similar, but they've had a different trajectory, right? They started at different places. So what I found was, I was trying to figure out trying to figure a way to explain how, what was it that was the basis of kinship tradition? What was the basis of kinship practices? And one of my committee supervisors down in Arizona, that's where I did my PhD, Rob Williams, a Native American lawyer down there, a Lumbee from North Carolina. He told me, he's a lawyer, so he says to me, well, why not thinking about customary kinship practices? I thought, customary kinship practices. I thought, okay. I mean, I really like that idea, customary kinship practices. These are, what we see here are somehow, some way tied to customary kinship practices. But how do we find out what those what are those customary kinship practices? Where do they come from? And so I was talking to an elder, I was talking to Maria Campbell, and she was telling me about these stories. And she had been talking about these stories for, to me for a number of years. And I remembered her saying that, these stories are the law of the people. These stories are the law of the people. And there's these stories that guided the way in which we were to interact with humans and non-humans, animals, waters, everything, right? It guided these are the guidelines that said, okay, this is how we're supposed to act, and that everything that we were supposed to interact with, whether they're humans or non-humans, all of these things were related to us. I thought, well, hey, they're all related to us. That's kinship, isn't it? So then I started to look for these stories. And these stories were, the stories in particular I was looking for, because there's lots of different kinds of stories, obviously. But the particular kinds of stories I was looking for were the elder brother stories. The elder brother stories, an elder brother was the kinship term for the trickster, right? The Cree and Soto trickster. Oh, and I got 5 minutes. So here's the big finish. So I started finding all these stories that had been recorded, that anthropologists had recorded from all over the place, in Western Canada. But then, it was like, I found this one story, these one set of stories that was recorded by Alison Skinner, anthropologist from, I forget how, from the States, someplace down there. He went and he came up to Manitoba and Saskatchewan and collected a whole bunch of stories. And he talked to people from Cowessess. And there were these Cowessess stories, these elder brother stories, collected in 1907 or so, published in about 1913, from about 4 or 5 elders from Cowessess. And so it was based on those stories. I looked at trying to flesh out the cultural understanding of the way in which kinship was supposed to be played out historically. And then I tried in the book, with interviewing people, I interviewed people about 25 people on reserve and in Regina. Most of the people I interviewed in Regina actually I interviewed out of First Nations University, because there was a lot of people from the janitor to the librarians, students, upper administration who were Cowessess members. So I then, based on those interviews, I tried to make the link between the stories and explaining how the way people talked about the way in which they practiced kinship, and I was able to make an argument that these are based on these traditional stories. Even though many of the people who I talked to did not have not heard the stories. Even if they haven't heard the stories, and whether the community is on reserve or in Regina, because Regina has about 1,000 members, Cowessess members live in Regina, probably more than that now. Out of a total of 4,000 members, about a quarter of the members live in Regina, and there's about just over 600 living on reserve. So there's definitely a big enough, a large enough community of Cowessess people in Regina to be able to have that sense of community within the city. So I was able then to make this link, or I would make the argument. I don't, people have to judge for themselves, I guess. But I make the argument that there's a link between traditional stories and contemporary kinship practices, and this made to me made a lot of sense to be able to explain the way in which people interact